Welcome to Nordic Dreams. Tonight we follow the mighty Thor, god of thunder. As he discovers something more powerful than Mjolnir itself, the deep peace that comes from true rest. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let us journey to the sacred mountains, where even the strongest of gods learns to find quiet. In the heart of ancient Norway, where the mountains touch the sky and the northern lights dance across eternal peaks, there stood a range so vast and so ancient that even the gods themselves would come here to find solitude. These were not ordinary mountains. These were the Jotun peaks, older than memory, older than the first songs sung by the skalds around their fires, older than the birth of the world tree Yggdrasil itself. The peaks rose like sleeping giants from the earth, their snow-covered summits gleaming silver under the eternal twilight of the Nordic summer. Each mountain had its own personality, its own ancient story written in the lines of stone and ice that marked their faces. Some were sharp and dramatic, piercing the sky like spears thrown by primordial gods. Others were gentle and rolling, their slopes covered in forests of pine and birch that whispered secrets in languages older than human speech. Between these ancient guardians lay valleys so deep and so sheltered that they seemed to exist in a different world entirely, a world where time moved more slowly, where the very air held healing properties, where the constant urgency of mortal and immortal concerns could not penetrate. These valleys were carpeted with moss so thick and soft that walking upon it was like treading on clouds, and filled with streams so pure they reflected not just the sky above, but somehow the deepest thoughts and dreams of all who gazed into their crystal depths. On this particular evening, as the midnight sun painted the sky in shades of gold, in amber and rose, casting long shadows that danced slowly across the valley floors, a figure approached these sacred heights. Not with the thunderous footsteps that usually announced his presence, not with lightning crackling around his mighty hammer, not with the ground trembling beneath his powerful stride, but with slow, deliberate steps that spoke of a different kind of purpose entirely. This was Thor, son of Odin Allfather, protector of Midgard and all its inhabitants, wielder of Mjolnir, the mighty hammer that could shatter mountains and summon storms from clear skies. But tonight, he was something else entirely. Tonight, he was simply a being who had grown weary from endless battles, tired from constant vigilance, exhausted from the weight of protecting all the 9 realms and every living creature within them. The Thunder God's appearance was markedly different this evening. Gone was the gleaming armor that caught lightning and reflected the fear in his enemies' eyes. Gone were the metal plates and chainmail that rang with each movement like a blacksmith's forge. Instead, he wore simple clothes, a rough-woven tunic of deep forest green, the color of pine, needles and shadow leather breeches worn soft from many journeys across the realms, and boots that had walked across all the worlds but tonight moved with the quiet grace of one who no longer needed to announce his presence to the universe. His red beard, usually wild with the energy of storms and crackling with residual lightning, was neatly braided with small silver charms that caught the fading light and tinkled softly with each step. These charms were not weapons or symbols of power, but simple tokens of peace, a silver oak leaf for endurance, a tiny hammer for gentle craft rather than destruction, a miniature mountain peak to remind him of this very journey he was taking. His eyes, those eyes that had seen the birth and death of stars, that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, that had looked into the faces of dragons and giants and mortals, with equal clarity now held a gentle tiredness, not the bone-deep exhaustion of defeat, but the good tiredness that comes from labor honestly done, battles honorably fought, in the growing wisdom of knowing when to lay down one's weapons and simply be. Mjolnir, his mighty hammer that could level mountains and summon lightning from clear skies. That had never failed him in battle, and had become as much a part of him as his own right hand hung quietly at his side. For once, it was not a weapon of war or a tool of divine justice, but simply a walking staff, its ancient magic, dormant and peaceful. The runes carved into its surface by the dwarf brothers, who had forged it in the heart of a dying star, glowed softly. Not with the fierce light of battle-ready power, but with the warm glow of a hearth fire on a cold night, gentle and comforting, and infinitely reassuring. As Thor climbed higher into these ancient peaks, each step took him further from the world of conflict. and responsibility, and closer to something he had almost forgotten existed in his centuries of vigilant protection. Silence. True silence. Not the tense quiet before battle, when every warrior holds his breath and listens for the first sound of approaching enemies. It's not the hollow emptiness after victory.
Yeah.
When the battlefield falls quiet, but the air still vibrates with the memory of violence. But the deep, nurturing silence of the earth itself, the profound quiet that speaks not of absence, but of presence, so complete that words become unnecessary. The path he followed was worn smooth by countless pilgrims, not warriors seeking strength or power, not heroes pursuing glory or conquest, but weary souls seeking the one thing that all the strength and power and glory in the universe could not provide: genuine rest. It wound through groves of silver birch trees whose leaves whispered ancient lullabies in languages that predated human speech. Past streams so clear they reflected not just the sky above, but somehow the peace within the hearts of all who looked into their crystalline depths. These streams sang as they flowed, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the bones and blood of anyone who listened. The sound was neither loud nor soft, but perfectly calibrated to the frequency that calmed racing hearts and quieted anxious minds. Thor found himself unconsciously matching his breathing to the rhythm of the flowing water. And with each breath that followed this ancient pattern, he felt another layer of battle readiness fall away from his spirit. With each step higher into these sacred peaks, Thor felt the tension leaving his mighty frame in waves. His shoulders, which had been tight with the constant readiness for battle, with the eternal preparation to defend the innocent against forces that would destroy them, began to soften and drop. The muscles between his shoulder blades, which had been knotted with the stress of carrying responsibility for the safety of entire worlds, slowly began to unknot and release. His hands, which had gripped Mjolnir so tightly for so long that they had forgotten how to fully relax, slowly began to unclench. Finger by finger, the death grip of constant vigilance loosened, until his hands hung naturally at his sides, open and soft and receptive, rather than closed and hard and ready to strike, his breathing usually quick and powerful like the wind before a storm. Like the sharp intake of air before a mighty blow is struck, began to slow and deepen, matching the ancient rhythm of the mountains themselves. Each inhale brought not just air into his lungs, but peace into his spirit. Each exhale released not just carbon dioxide, but worry, tension, the constant alertness that had kept him ready for any threat that might emerge from any shadow. The air here was different from any atmosphere Thor had breathed in all his travels across the 9 realms. It carried the scent of pine and mountain herbs of snow that had never melted, because it was too pure to ever leave these sacred peaks and flowers that bloomed eternal in the midnight, sun sustained not by soil and water alone, but by the accumulated peace of centuries. But more than that, it carried something intangible yet unmistakable, a quality that made every breath feel like a small blessing, every exhale a release of burdens that had been carried too long. As the path curved around a massive granite boulder, carved with protective runes by hands that had been dust for 1,000 years, runes that glowed faintly with their own inner light, like stars embedded in stone, Thor paused. The sight that opened before him made even the god of thunder catch his breath in wonder. Not the sharp gasp of surprise, but the slow, deep inhalation of awe that comes when the soul recognizes something it has been seeking without knowing it was searching. A valley stretched out below him, hidden between towering peaks like a secret that the mountains had kept for ages beyond counting. Here the northern lights danced not far overhead in the distant sky, but close. So close he could almost reach out and touch the ribbons of green and purple and silver and gold that moved like slow, gentle waves across the star-filled dome of heaven. This was the sacred valley of Stanji, the place of peaceful columns, where the ancient ones had come to rest their spirits when the weight of existence became too much to bear while standing. Here the mountains themselves seemed to breathe with a slow, steady rhythm that invited all who entered to match their own breathing to this ancient pace, to surrender their quick mortal urgency to the patient wisdom of stone and ice and eternal sky. The valley floor was carpeted with the softest moss Thor had ever felt beneath his feet. Moss so thick and luxurious that each step sank slightly into this natural cushion, as if the earth itself was offering comfort to his tired bones and muscles that had been tight with battle readiness for far too long. Small wildflowers dotted this emerald carpet like stars fallen to earth, Arctic poppies with petals like silk that seemed to glow with their own inner light, mountain avens with faces turned toward the eternal illumination above, and tiny forget-me-nots that pulsed gently with a blue radiance that matched the deeper tones in the dancing lights overhead. Thor began his descent into the valley, and with each downward step, he felt himself sinking not just toward the earth, but toward a state of being he had nearly forgotten existed in his centuries of protecting the realms. The weight of Mjolnir at his side no longer felt like a burden of responsibility, like the constant reminder of duties yet to be fulfilled, and battles yet to be fought, but like a comforting presence, an old friend walking beside him into this realm of peace, where weapons became tools of creation rather than destruction. Scattered throughout the valley were ancient stone circles, each one carefully arranged by hands long since returned to dust by pilgrims, who had understood that the deepest magic was not in the summoning of power, but in the willing surrender of it. These were not monuments to war or conquest, not altars of sacrifice or displays of dominance, but simple, humble altars to rest itself, to the sacred act of laying down one's burdens and trusting in something larger than individual will. Some circles were no larger than a sleeping person, intimate spaces designed for solitary rest and personal healing. Others were grand enough for a giant to lie within, community spaces where entire families of travelers might find refuge together. Each circle was filled with the same impossibly soft moss, and each one seemed to hum with a barely audible frequency that resonated deep in Thor's chest, a vibration so subtle it was felt rather than heard, slowing his heartbeat to match the eternal rhythm of the mountains themselves. As he walked among these sacred resting places, Thor noticed that his usual thunderous footsteps had become whisper quiet, without any conscious effort on his part. It was not that he was trying to be silent or sneaking through the valley like a thief in the night. Rather, the valley itself seemed to absorb all harshness, all suddenness, all the sharp edges of the waking world where conflicts must be resolved quickly and decisions made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Here, everything moved with the fluid grace of water finding its path down a mountainside, with the gentle persistence of growing things that know their time will come without forcing, with the unhurried wisdom of stone that measures time not in moments or hours or years, but in the slow dance of geological ages. Even the wind moved differently here, not with the sharp gusts and sudden changes of the world below, but in long, slow currents that seemed to breathe with the mountains themselves. Near the center of the valley, beside a crystal-clear spring that bubbled up from some deep, hidden source far beneath the mountain's roots, Thor found a circle of stones that seemed to call to him with a voice he felt rather than heard. Unlike the others, this circle was perfectly sized for his large frame, as if it had been waiting specifically for him, prepared by the wisdom of the mountain for this exact moment when the god of thunder would finally come seeking rest. The moss within this particular circle was the deepest, softest green he had ever seen. A color so rich and vibrant, it seemed to contain all the life force of the mountain, concentrated into this one perfect resting place. The stones themselves were smooth river rocks, worn perfectly round by countless years of flowing water, polished by time and weather until they gleamed like jewels in the gentle light of the dancing aurora overhead. But it was not just the physical comfort that drew him to this place, though the circle offered more luxury than any bed in Asgard's golden halls. As he approached the ring of stones, Thor felt something he had not experienced in centuries: the complete absence of urgency. For the first time in memory, stretching back through countless seasons of protecting the realms, there was nowhere he needed to be, no battle calling for his attention, no crisis requiring his immediate intervention, no threat looming on any horizon that demanded his constant vigilance. The realms would continue turning without him for these precious hours. The sun would rise and set, the seasons would change, mortals would live their lives and make their choices, and the great wheel of existence would maintain its balance without requiring his mighty hand to steady it. For once the cosmos had given him permission to simply exist without purpose, to be without doing, to rest without the guilt that usually accompanied any moment. When he was not actively protecting someone or something, he set me all near gently beside the stone circle, and for the first time in ages, the hammer seemed to sigh with relief. Its metal surface releasing a tension Thor had not even realized it had been holding. Its surface, usually crackling with barely contained lightning, ready to unleash devastating power at a moment's notice, now reflected only the soft, dancing lights above, as peaceful as a still pond reflecting clouds. The leather grip worn smooth by Thor's strong hands through countless battles against frost giants and dark elves and creatures that emerged from the spaces between worlds, seemed to settle into the moss like an old friend finding a comfortable chair after a long journey. Even Mjolnir, instrument of divine justice and cosmic protection, needed this rest. This opportunity to simply be a beautifully crafted tool rather than a weapon of war. Thor removed his simple tunic and boots, feeling the mountain air against his skin like a blessing from the ancient spirits that dwelt in these peaks. The evening was warm despite the altitude, heated by the eternal midnight sun that never quite set in these sacred heights. During the blessed months, when the world turned its face fully toward the light, the air itself seemed to caress his weathered skin, carrying away not just the heat of exertion from his climb, but the deeper heat of constant readiness, the internal fire that had kept him battle-ready for so many centuries. He stretched his powerful arms above his head, reaching toward the dancing lights, as if he could gather some of their peace and pull it down into his body. As he stretched, he felt muscles that had been tense for decades finally begin to release their hold on positions of defense and attack. His back, which had been curved slightly forward in the perpetual stance of readiness to swing his hammer, slowly straightened and opened, allowing his chest to expand fully for the first time in memory. His neck thick and strong from bearing the weight of his mighty head through every nodding approval of battle. Plans every sharp turn to face new challenges. Every careful scan of horizons for approaching threats now rolled slowly from side to side, releasing knots of tension that had become so familiar he had forgotten they were there. Thor's powerful legs, which had carried him across all the 9 worlds in pursuit of justice and protection, which had stood firm against the charge of frost giants and the fury of dragons, which had never faltered no matter how impossible the odds or how fierce the enemy, began to tremble slightly, not with weakness or fear, but with the overwhelming relief of finally being allowed to stop carrying their constant burden of readiness. Sitting on the edge of the stone circle, Thor dipped his feet into the crystal spring, and immediately understood why this place was considered sacred by all who had found it. The water was neither hot nor cold, but exactly the perfect temperature that made his tired muscles sing with relief, not the sharp relief of pain, ending, but the deep soul-satisfying relief of tension that had been held so long, it had become part of his identity, finally being allowed to dissolve. Small fish, silver as moonlight and translucent as living crystal, swam curious circles around his ankles. Their gentle touches were like tiny massages that sent waves of relaxation up through his entire body, each small contact a reminder that he was safe here, that nothing in this sacred space would ask anything of him, except that he allow himself to receive comfort. The spring bubbled and murmured with a sound like the softest lullaby. Thor found himself listening not to words, for there were no words in any language that could improve upon this perfect sound, but to the rhythm beneath the music. It was the heartbeat of the mountain itself, slow and steady and infinitely patient. A pulse that had been beating since before the first sunrise and would continue long after the last star faded from the sky. As he sat there with his feet in the healing waters, Thor began to notice details that his warrior's eyes, trained to spot threats and assess dangers, had long overlooked in his focus on protection and battle. The way individual blades of moss caught and held tiny droplets of mist like precious jewels, each one a perfect sphere that contained an entire miniature world of reflected light. The intricate patterns that frost made on the nearby stones, delicate as the finest lace and twice as beautiful, created by the patient work of cold air and moisture over countless nights. He noticed the way the northern lights reflected in the spring water, creating the illusion that he was sitting at the edge of the sky itself. The boundary between earth and heaven had dissolved in this sacred place. The lights in the water moved independently of those in the sky, creating a double dance of illumination that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond the physical, in realms of pure beauty and endless peace. A gentle breeze stirred through the valley, carrying with it the scent of mountain herbs and something else, something that smelled like peace itself. If peace could have a fragrance, it was clean and pure and somehow familiar, like a half-remembered dream of childhood. Safety, of being small enough to be completely protected, of trusting so completely in the strength of those who loved him that sleep came as easily as breathing. Thor closed his eyes and tilted his face toward this gentle wind, feeling it lift the heavy braids of his beard and cool his weathered cheeks. The breeze seemed to carry away not just the heat from his skin, but the heat from his spirit, the constant fire of readiness that had burned within him. For so long he had forgotten what it felt like to exist without its driving energy. For the first time in so long that he could not remember when it had last happened, Thor's face relaxed completely. The lines that worry and constant vigilance had carved around his eyes, lines that spoke of scanning horizons for threats and watching over sleeping mortals through long nights, slowly softened and faded. His jaw clenched tight with the responsibility of making decisions that affected the fate of worlds. Slowly released its tension until his mouth fell slightly open in the natural position of complete relaxation. Even his forehead, which had been creased with the concentration required to solve problems that had no easy answers, to find paths through conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve, gradually smoothed, until it was as peaceful as the surface of the spring beside him. The deep sigh that seemed to release centuries of held breath, all the air he had drawn in preparation for battles that were now finished. For challenges that had been met and overcome, Thor lowered himself into the stone circle. The moss beneath him was softer than any bed in Asgard's golden halls, more comfortable than the finest furs in his father's great hall, more supportive than any throne or chair designed by the most skilled craftsmen in all the realms. It seemed to mold itself perfectly to his large frame, supporting every part of his body with exactly the right amount of gentle firmness. His head found a natural pillow in a slightly raised section of moss's neck, settled into a depression that seemed designed specifically for his proportions, his broad back pressed into a surface that yielded just enough to cradle his spine while remaining firm enough to provide perfect support. As he settled into this natural bed, Thor felt the stones around him begin to radiate a warm, steady heat. Not the fierce heat of his lightning, which could melt metal and split stone, not the sudden blazing heat of battle fury that had carried him through so many conflicts, but the nurturing warmth of a mother's embrace, the gentle heat of a perfect summer day that soaks into tired muscles and helps them remember how to be soft. The warmth seeped into his bones, into muscles that had been tight with battle readiness for so long they had forgotten their natural state of relaxation. It traveled through his body like a gentle tide, reaching every cell, every fiber, every part of his being that had been held in the constant tension of readiness, and offered each part permission to finally, completely let go. Above him, the northern lights continued their eternal dance, but now they seemed to be performing just for him, a private show of cosmic beauty choreographed by the universe itself for this one perfect moment of surrender. The ribbons of green and silver light moved in slow, hypnotic patterns that drew his gaze upward and inward simultaneously, each wave of light seeming to carry away another layer of tension, another fragment of the weight he had carried for so long. It had become part of his identity. The lights pulsed gently, and with each pulse, Thor felt himself sinking deeper into the embrace of the mountain, deeper into a state of rest that went beyond physical comfort to touch something fundamental in his divine nature. This was not just the relaxation of tired muscles, but the restoration of a spirit that had given so much of itself in service to others that it had nearly forgotten how to receive. As Thor surrendered more completely to the mountains, embrace feeling his consciousness begin to merge with the ancient peace of these peaks. The boundary between his individual awareness and the eternal dream of the mountains began to blur in the most beautiful way imaginable. He was no longer just Thor resting in the mountains. He was becoming part of the mountain's eternal dream of peace, joining his spirit to the collective rest of all who had ever found refuge in this sacred place. The northern lights above seemed to sense this profound transformation, this moment when a god chose vulnerability over strength, rest over action, being over doing. Their dance became even more gentle, more intimate, more personal. The ribbons of light began to descend like the gentle fingers of a cosmic mother coming to tuck her most beloved child into bed, reaching down toward the valley with movements so graceful they seemed choreographed by love itself. As these lights touched the edges of the stone circle, They brought with them a warmth that penetrated not just Thor's body, but his very soul, his divine essence, the core of what made him who he was beyond all, the titles and responsibilities and mighty deeds. This warmth was different from any heat he had ever experienced. It was the warmth of unconditional acceptance, of being loved not for what he could do or protect or accomplish, but simply for existing. In this deepening state of rest, Thor began to dream while still awake, a rare gift that the mountains bestowed only upon those who truly surrendered to their peace, who released their grip on control and allowed themselves to be held by something infinitely larger and more patient than individual will. In this waking dream, he found himself not as the mighty thunder god with all his powers and responsibilities, but as a simple mountain dweller, living in perfect harmony with the rhythm of stone and sky and seasons. He dreamed of mornings that began not with the clash of weapons or the urgent calls of crisis, but with the gentle call of mountain birds welcoming the sun with songs of pure joy. He saw himself waking slowly, naturally, without urgency or alarm, in a simple stone cottage built into the living rock of the mountain itself, where sunlight streamed through windows carved directly into the stone and filled the space with the golden warmth of peaceful dawning. In this dream cottage, Mjolnir hung not as a weapon of war or even a tool of justice, but as an instrument of creation and gentle craft. He saw himself using its perfect weight and balance not to shatter the shields of enemies, but to shape beautiful things from wood and stone, perhaps to craft furniture from fallen trees that had lived full lives and died naturally, or to shape stone for pathways through wildflower gardens where children could play safely and lovers could walk hand in hand under starlight. The dream continued, unfolding like a flower blooming in slow motion, showing Thor days filled not with battles and crises and urgent decisions that affected the fate of worlds, but with simple, peaceful tasks that nourished the soul as much as they accomplished practical purposes. He saw himself tending a garden where vegetables grew larger and more nourishing, because they were watered with mountain springs and warmed by his gentle presence, where the very soil seemed to respond to his contentment by becoming more fertile and generous. He watched himself crafting useful things with his powerful hands, not weapons of war, but tools of peace and creation. Bowls carved from mountain oak, with a patience that allowed the wood's natural grain to guide the shape. Tools shaped from star-fallen metal, forged not in the heat of urgency, but in the gentle warmth of contemplation. Blankets woven from the soft wool of mountain sheep, who grazed in high meadows and whose fleece carried the peace of their elevated life into every thread. In this peaceful vision, Thor's incredible strength was not diminished or wasted, but transformed and elevated. Instead of using his might to destroy threats before they could harm the innocent, he used it to create beauty that inspired and comforted. Instead of his voice booming across battlefields with commands and war cries, it hummed gentle working songs that made plants grow stronger and animals feel safe enough to approach and accept food from his hands. Instead of his presence inspiring fear in enemies or even nervous awe in allies, it brought comfort to all living things that dwelt in these sacred peaks. Mountain goats would come to him for gentle scratches behind their horns. Eagles would perch nearby, not because they were tame, but because they recognized in him a kindred spirit who understood the view from great heights and the responsibility that came with strength. The dream showed him evenings by a simple hearth built from stones gathered from the sacred spring, where the fire burned with the steady warmth of contentment, rather than the fierce blaze of passion or anger. Here he would sit and listen to the mountainous own stories, tales told not in words but in the subtle shifts of wind and light, in the patient movement of ice and the slow dance of seasons, in the quiet heroism of small creatures surviving and thriving in this harsh but endlessly nurturing landscape. As this peaceful vision continued to unfold in Thor's resting consciousness, his physical body in the stone circle relaxed even more deeply, reaching levels of peace he had not known were possible for someone of his divine nature. His breathing became so slow and gentle that it barely disturbed the mountain air, each breath lasting longer than the last, as his body learned to trust that it would be given all the air it needed without effort or struggle. His heartbeat, usually strong and quick with the energy of action and the readiness to leap into battle at a moment's notice, now matched the patient pulse of the earth beneath him. Slow, steady, eternal, measuring time not in the urgent moments of crisis, but in the vast, peaceful rhythms of a world at rest. The moss beneath him seemed to grow softer and deeper with each passing moment, as if the mountain was adjusting itself continuously to provide perfect comfort for this weary god. The stones of the circle radiated warmth that penetrated to his very core, melting away tensions he had carried for so long that he had forgotten they were there, releasing knots of worry and responsibility that had become such a part of him he had thought them permanent. Thor's mighty frame, which had stood firm against forces that could destroy worlds, now settled into the earth with complete surrender. His body became as still and permanent as the mountain, stone itself, as if he were not just resting upon the earth, but becoming part of it, joining his strength to the quiet, enduring power of the peaks that had stood sentinel over these lands since the world was young, as consciousness began its final, gentle retreat toward the realm of dreams. Thor felt himself expanding beyond the boundaries of his individual existence. He was no longer just Thor, god of thunder, but part of something infinitely larger, the eternal peace of the mountains, the patient wisdom of stone, the gentle power of earth that creates and sustains all life through the simple act of being willing to support and nurture, without asking for anything in return. The last thing he was aware of before sleep claimed him completely was the sound of the mountain breathing around him, the slow inhale and exhale of stone and ice and growing things, all participating in the cosmic rhythm of rest. And in that final moment of consciousness, Thor smiled. Not the fierce grin of victory in battle, but the soft smile of a child who knows he is completely safe, completely loved, completely free to rest without fear. The mountain held him safely through the eternal night, and the northern lights danced their ancient lullaby until consciousness dissolved completely into the peaceful heart of the eternal mountains, where all beings, mortal and divine, find their truest rest. Sleep well, mighty one. Let Thor's peace become your peace. Let the ancient stones support you as they support him. Let the northern lights dance you into the deepest, most restorative sleep you have ever known.